When someone calls themselves Reform, what do they mean? The word gets tossed around, and some people mean one thing and some people mean another, and sometimes the best thing to do is just ask the person what they mean. So what I've done is gone around, asked people what they mean when they refer to themselves as Reformed, and I'm going to give you the answer. And it's what I mean when I use the term Reformed. It's three things, okay? First, it means they're Calvinistic. Secondly, it means they're confessional. And thirdly, it means they're covenantal in their view of the scriptures. So let's unpack what those three things mean. In Reformed theology is Calvinistic. By that, there means that they adhere to the doctrines of grace, sometimes summarized in the acrostic TULIP, TULIP, which stands for total depravity or total inability, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and the perseverance of the saints. Did we get it all? TULIP. I think so. And that's a monergistic view of salvation, meaning that God is the one that saves us, that it's not us, so to speak, assisting and cooperating with God's grace and therefore being saved, but that it's an act and a move of God upon us, that salvation is God's initiation and God's work. And it's not something we cooperate in, that we don't cooperate with his grace to obtain salvation. That would be a monergistic view of salvation, one of the tenets of Reformed theology. Now, here's where this can be a little bit confusing. There's many people who are Calvinistic who are not Reformed. Okay, so there's many people who don't adhere to these other two things, but they are Calvinistic. So we wouldn't necessarily refer to themselves as Reformed. But some of the confusion comes from when someone refers to themselves as Reformed, what they mean is that they're Calvinistic. But if you don't subscribe to these other two things, typically Reformed people would look at you as if you're confused. They wouldn't look down on you, right? But the word Reform means something different than just Calvinistic. It's sort of like this. All bikes are wheeled vehicles, right? All bikes are wheeled modes of transportation. But not all modes of transportation are bikes. So in the same way, all Reformed people are Calvinistic, but not all Calvinistic people are Reformed. So just like bike is a type of wheeled vehicle, Reformed is a type of Calvinistic theology, a specific type of it, okay? So yes, Reformed theology is Calvinistic theology. It's monergistic, ascribing salvation to God alone and to his acting alone. Secondly, it's confessional theology. So by this, Reformed people adhere to one of the historic confessions of the Reformation or post-Reformation area. Now we could list the three of those, the Westminster, the Savoy, and the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith. We would also include in that the Continental Confession, like the Belgic Confession of Faith. Typically, the only ones that get talked about are the Westminster, the Belgic, and the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith. I haven't seen a bunch of Congregationalists waving the flag of the Savoy Declaration, though in total, it's a better document than the Westminster, and the Second London is better than both of those. But let's get back on point. Reformed theology is confessional, meaning somebody who's Reformed would adhere to one of those historic confessions or to one of the historic catechisms of the Christian faith, like the Westminster Larger, Shorter Catechism, the Continental Confession, the Heidelberg Confession of Faith, or the Hercules Collins version of that called Orthodox Catechism, Benjamin Keach's Baptist Catechism. Adhering to one of those things is a a qualification for being Reformed. It's one of the things someone means when they say they're Reformed, that they're Calvinistic, they're confessional, that they adhere to and teach one of the historic confessions of faith. And then it's also covenantal, meaning it has a specific view of God's salvation in the scriptures, meaning there's one way of salvation in the scriptures. There's one covenant of grace in the scripture that's progressively revealed through time. That there's a covenant of works in the garden. Some people don't call it that. Benjamin Keach, for example, in the Catechism referred to it as a covenant of life, but many people it's synonymous with the covenant of works in the garden, which was broken. Man fell into sin, and God intended through all eternity in making a covenant of grace to redeem the elect whom he had chosen since before the foundation of the world. And so Reformed theology is different from, let's say, dispensational theology, which cuts up the Bible into different dispensations, and there's more fuller expositions of the differences between dispensationalism and covenant theology in other videos, so we'll leave that off for another day. You can ask me if you want more information on covenant theology versus dispensationalism, or even Baptist covenant theology versus Westminster covenant theology. That's not the same. But all of that is to say that Reformed theology isn't dispensational theology. It's not dispensationalism. We wouldn't agree with folks like Schofield or even a popular preacher whom I wouldn't discourage you from listening to on the West Coast. And you're probably familiar with John MacArthur. He's an example of a Calvinist who's dispensational, who many Reformed people like, but he's not like Reformed. We wouldn't refer to him as Reformed, though that's not to slight him. It's not to put him down, or it's not to say our camp is different than his and therefore he is inferior. But he's a good example of somebody who's Calvinistic but dispensational and not Reformed. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what people mean when they say Reformed. A lot of people put other things in there, like the 5 solas of the Reformation. That sort of goes without saying if you're Calvinistic. We'll get maybe specific in some future videos with what somebody means when they call themselves a Reformed Baptist. But with that, I think we've hopefully made it clear. What does somebody mean when they say they're Reformed? It means they're Calvinistic, confessional, and covenantal in their view of the scriptures. I do wish you well. I hope to see you in the next one.